So as many of you will know, when pro players play Gekko, I tend to not like it. And generally, we haven't seen a very good Gekko, in my opinion, at the highest levels of this game. Now, of course, up until now, maybe that's not been the biggest problem in the world because Gekko hasn't been picked that often in a lot of these games. But of course, with the Sky nerf coming in, a lot of people are now suspecting that Gekko might become a somewhat popular choice across a variety of maps. And that got me very worried, because I think we could see a lot of very bad Gekko. But to just quickly prove the point about Gekko's pick rate increasing, we've actually already started to see some semblance of that coming to fruition. For instance, if we take a look at his pick rate at Valorant Champs 2023, you see it was only 3%. But if we start to come to some of the tier 2 leagues that have already started, you see that it is a bit higher. For instance, let's just take the Turkey league, for instance, here. You can see that Gekko is actually all the way up at 10%. And in fact, if we actually only include the weeks, the more recent weeks where the Sky nerf has started to really take effect, you see that Gekko is actually all the way up at 17%, which is not a ton, but it definitely is increasing. Well, what I wanted to see was, how are people actually doing on Gekko? Is it working pretty well or not? So what I decided to do was this. I tracked the last 50 games that I could find on VLR of a bunch of tier 2 leagues across the world of Gekko being used. And here they all are, right? And I got the stats for the VLR rating, the ACS, the assists they had in the game, and whether they won or not. And then after averaging all of those, this is what we got. We got the VLR rating of 0.95, ACS 176, assists 5.5 a game, and win percentage actually was 62.75%. Now, what that tells me from those stats is that, as we saw from the VLR rating and the ACS, it was a bit below average. Whoever is actually on the Gekko themselves tends not to be doing necessarily the best overall, or, performing monstrously as an individual. But what was interesting was the win percentage was really quite high. Like, anything above 60% win rate for an agent is really quite good, right? Because there are some mirror games in there as well where both teams are playing Gekko, and that means that one of them has to win and one of them has to lose, and that's going to tend you towards 50%. Now, that wasn't a massive amount of games for Gekko, but it was in there sometimes. But still, even without that, 62.75% is a really high number, which brings up some questions of maybe Gekko is actually quite good, even if the person playing Gekko maybe, isn't finding a massive amount of kills themselves or necessarily even assists. But that, of course, is still a small sample size, and I did think that maybe those numbers lacked a bit of context as well overall. So what I decided to do was do the same thing for Sova. Now, the reason I picked Sova was because I felt like that they would play a similar sort of more supportive role. What I mean by that is, you might think the obvious comparison would be to Sky, an agent that Gekko is likely replacing in a lot of these team comps. But the thing is with Sky, of course, different leagues might be on different patches, and therefore some might have the Sky nerf, some might not, so it might make it a bit difficult there. But also, I feel like Gekko doesn't maybe have the same individualistic utility that maybe Sky does, and I thought that Sova is a safe choice that, Sova has been out forever, everyone kind of understands and knows how to play that agent, but also generally plays a more supportive backline role. And so for Sova's 50 games, what we got was this instead. We got a much, much higher individual performance, both in terms of VLR rating, as you can see, but also ACS, and slightly higher in assists. But the win rate was actually a lot lower for Sova. Now again, the win rate for Sova was a lot lower because there was a lot more mirror games for Sova in general, right? Whether that was on Ascent or Icebox games, generally speaking, both teams will be playing Sova most of the time, so he had more games that were just going to condense him down to, closer to 50%, which is absolutely fine. That's not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but I do think that the numbers can kind of show you that, if our VLR rating for Sova is quite drastically higher than someone like Gekko, that's really what I'm kind of interested in. That, to me, there's still probably truth to the fact that a lot of these pro players don't really know fully how to use Gekko just yet and are potentially struggling. But I wanted to go and do some comparisons as well to see, like, how bad is it for maybe some of these Gekkos. And if we take a look at some of these stats here, like I've got here, right? VLR less than 0.5 rating, right? That to me is like you've had a catastrophic game. Like, you really have had an absolute stinker there, right? To have that low of a rating. And you see that Gekko, that happened 7 times for Gekko, but it didn't happen once for Sova. But interestingly enough, if you change that number to less than 0.75 rating, which let's say is like a bad game, but not necessarily like an all-time stinker, but just, a bad game, you see it's actually much more even, right? That there was now 15 geckos that fit that criteria, but there was also 12 sovas. So there's still plenty of bad sova games, but there weren't necessarily any truly catastrophic ones that I saw in my sample. And the same is somewhat true for ACS, right? Like ACS less than 100, you're not doing a lot, right? And again, there were 7 different geckos that did this, and it wasn't exactly the same 7 either. So, you know, that can still happen and shows you that. And for ACS less than 150, again, not great. You know, you do see that, yes, there are quite a few sovas entering in now with 10, but there's still quite a bit more of the Gekko. Now for ACS, there is some caveats because Sova does have some damaging abilities like the Shock Dart and the Ult, of course, which will regularly do damage in a round, which might increase your ACS, and that might explain part of this. And Gekko obviously does have the Mosh Pit, but that tends to be more of a, you know, a tiny amount of damage or a kill. And for assist games less than 3, so you aren't getting many assists either, you can see that again, there was more geckos than there were Sovas. But then on the flip side, if we look at like when people had really good games, you can start to see some patterns emerge as well, which is for the VLR over a 1.5 rating, so an outstanding game, it's actually pretty similar. It's only 6-4, right? That's not too different. But when we look at over 1.25, which you might consider like just having like a pretty good game, like you've done really well, it was 19-7 in favor of Sova, which feels like a massive gap. In a 50-game sample size, 19 of them were over a 1.25 rating for Sova, but really not that many for Gekko. Now, in terms of ACS, that maybe didn't bear out as much because you can see the numbers aren't too different in terms of the Sovas and Geckos over here. And in fact, actually, in terms of having a lot of assists in a game, there was actually more Geckos than there were Sovas. But I think from this dataset, what I could kind of conclude was that if people are going to be playing a lot of Gekko at like the highest levels of the game, I just hope that they have put in the time, because from what I can tell thus far and having, you know, just watched some of these geckos as well play, it still feels like people don't really know how to use the agent, right? They still end up in a lot of situations where they aren't picking up the abilities that much, or, you know, their ability goes off into a place where it can't even be picked up, right? It goes off the map or something like that, right? And you just waste the potential of it. Particularly on the defensive side, I don't think I've ever really seen someone use Gekko on the defensive side and thought, wow, they've really solved this agent. They've really come up with something that, you know, can consistently find value there and a game plan that works throughout the entirety of a map. So I wouldn't be surprised if we did start to see more Gekko, but my worry here really is that if the players who are playing the Gekko haven't had time to really, you know, understand the agent and play it to a very high level with a very good understanding of what they want to do in mind, that if they struggle, maybe we do start to see them move away from a Gekko instead, and as quickly as the Gekko meta starts, it could be gone. The thing is, though, as was pointed out at the kind of start of this video, the win rate for Gekko is actually very good, and if that continues on and keeps on in that kind of way, I mean, winning is the most important thing, so maybe even if the stats kind of can't really tell us, maybe Gekko is pretty good to helping you win games, and if that's the case, well then we probably can expect to see quite a bit of Gekko.